if we continue to treat Earth orbit as if it is infinite, the next generation is going to look back at us and say, you guys were crazy. You should have known because you did this with the oceans. You have a plastic crisis in the ocean that you didn't see 20 years before. And now this generation, the decision makers today, they know about plastic in the ocean. They're being more careful about that, but they're being completely careless when it comes to putting more and more mass in orbit.
Hey, Space Watchers, and welcome to Space Café Radio. Today, we are speaking with Professor Mike Byers, the co-director of the Outer Space Institute in Vancouver. And we do that in a street cafe in the middle of Berlin. So if you hear background noise, that is all for the atmosphere and for the setting. The Outer Space Institute is a global network addressing urgent challenges in space governance. And that includes from space debris and mega constellations to ASAT tests and environmental impact. And Michael has been at the front line of shaping policy with science. Michael, thanks for joining us today. How are you doing?
I'm very glad to be here. Just so your listeners know, it is a beautiful late summer day in Berlin, and we are sitting outside in our shirt sleeves.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's kick that off. Let's talk about Outer Space Institute's mission and method. So what is the Outer Space Institute, and how do you decide which governance issues to tackle?
The Outer Space Institute began as a collaboration between Aaron Bowley and myself. Aaron is a professor of astronomy at the University of British Columbia. He's an astrophysicist who became interested in space policy and space law because of the issue of light pollution from satellites, challenging the ability of astronomers to do their science. And I come from a background in both international politics and international law, and had done a great deal of work on areas beyond national jurisdiction, like the world's oceans and also the Arctic. And we met in 2017 and realized once we started talking that we were able to identify entirely new issues because very few conversations had previously taken place between astrophysicists and people like me, international lawyers, political scientists. And we started talking about light pollution. We started talking about space debris. We moved on from there to issues of space mining, and the list goes on. We've built a global network of fellows, some of them known, senior people, others younger, future superstars. This has enabled us to connect with government and with industry and with perspectives from other parts of the world. And then in the last number of years, we've also built a team of brilliant young students and early career researchers who, like Aaron and myself, are based at the University of British Columbia in Canada. Although the Outer Space Institute itself is a non-governmental organization, and we like to insist that it is not Canadian, it is global.
Okay, I see. We had the pleasure to welcome you and Aaron in previous Space Cafes in our webinar series in our Space Cafe Canada, which we were very grateful for your contribution. But today it's the first time that we meet in person, what is absolutely exciting. Coming back to your academic work, so what is your recipe to turn this academic work into actual policy influence?
First of all, you need to be adding something new to the conversation. Bringing together the natural sciences and the social sciences enables us to not just discover new issues, but to identify new aspects to problems that people already know exist, or to come up with new solutions. For instance, we have a brilliant PhD student named Ewan Wright, who has been working on the issue of reentries, rocket body and satellite reentries, and particularly the issue of casualty risks for the last 4 years. And he has been co-authoring with Aaron Bowley and myself very successfully in top academic journals. But there's also been a policy component to this. So thanks to my friend and mentor, Ram Jakku at McGill University, we realized that it's not always easy to get governments to care about a risk to one individual person on the planet being struck and killed by a piece of re-entry in space debris. But governments do become interested when you talk about an Airbus or a Boeing aircraft being struck by a piece of re-entry in space debris, because just 300 grams could result in a catastrophic accident killing 200, 300 people. And so we organized a workshop in Montreal together with the McGill Institute of Air and Space Law. The Secretary General of the International Civil Aviation Authority attended the workshop. And we've now seen some advancement in terms of policy movement because of the involvement of that international organization.
Isn't ICAO located in Montreal?
It is located in Montreal.
That might have made it easier.
That's why we held the workshop in Montreal.
Fair point.
So he only had to travel 200 meters. But the other thing that's interesting is that we are now advocating for a shift to a controlled reentry regime, so that we say no rockets should be launched unless the launch provider can ensure that both the first stage and the second stage are brought back to Earth in a controlled manner and deposited in a remote area of ocean. And we have the technology. You need engines that can reignite. You need to have mission designs that retain some fuel to enable controlled reentry, but it is possible. And we ran into some skepticism. And then because of my background in ocean governance, I was able to say, hang on a second, this is not new. In the 1970s and the 1980s, there were people like Aaron and myself advocating for double-hulled tankers, for all oil tankers to have two hulls, one inside the other, to protect against spills. But it took the Exxon Valdez oil spill on the coast of Alaska to generate the political will to make a change. And within 1 year after that oil spill, the United States adopted a law that prohibited single-hulled tankers from accessing American ports. And within the next 2 years, the International Maritime Organization amended the relevant treaty, Convention on the Safety of Life at Sea, to require double-hulled tankers. They gave a transition period, but there are far fewer oil spills on the world oceans today because governments got serious about introducing a new safety requirement with regards to transportation in an area beyond national jurisdiction. And if we can do that with oil tankers, we can do it with rocket bodies. So again, my background in oceans enabled me to find a precedent policy solution. It's not perfect. It's not a perfect match, but it's an example of what can happen when you have new knowledge, a new awareness of risk, and there is a technological change possible.
If we broaden the scope to the space governance or governance gap, so if you had to name a single most pressing governance gap in space today, what would it be, and why has it proven so difficult to close? You just made one example from the past, how it is possible to drive international governments, international policy by an accident, by a single event. Where are we in space? I mean, we have all the conversations going on UNIDIR, on UN COPIUS, but it seems to be very slow moving.
Yes, although it is moving, right? COPIUS is still meeting. They are still adopting a final report at the end of each plenary session. There are still good, useful things being done. Cannot say the same thing about the Conference on Disarmament. But there is still cooperation happening in space, the International Space Station, the COSPAS-SARSAT Search and Rescue System, the Disasters Charter, and COPIUS. UN COPIUS still works slowly. And it is perhaps avoiding some of the most difficult conversations. So here's a difficult conversation that we all need to have. Earth orbit is not infinite. So we are talking about a limited resource. And we are treating Earth orbit the way that we used to treat the ocean. We just throw our garbage into the ocean. And the worst part of our treatment of low Earth orbit is that SpaceX adopted the consumer electronic product approach to its satellite system. So just like your mobile, your cell phone, the company doesn't intend for you to use that piece of equipment for more than 4 or 5 years. SpaceX satellites are intended to operate for 4 or 5 years and then to be replaced. So many thousands of satellites with short lifespans, few redundancies, intended to be actively deorbited on a continuous cycle. And The fact of the matter is, SpaceX has the best engineers in the world. And if a regulator had said to them, no, you can't have 12,000 satellites or 30,000 satellites, you have to do with far less. You have to build Starlink with just 5,000 satellites or 3,000 satellites. The engineers would have figured that out. They would have built better satellites, more redundancies, longer lifespan, higher capacity. And as a result, they would have put less mass into orbit. There would be less objects in orbit. There would be less of a need for automatic collision avoidance. There would be less risk of collisions. And then ultimately, there would be less material being actively deorbited, because this is all conditioned on the idea that somehow burning up deals with the satellite. And it doesn't, because mass never disappears. So if there's a 750 kilogram Starlink satellite that is being re-entered, it turns into 750 kilograms of particles, of aluminum and lithium, and it's going into the upper atmosphere. And we don't know what effects it will have on the climate system, on the ozone layer. The fact of the matter is that we are taking risks, not just with low Earth orbit, but with the atmosphere and therefore the entire Earth space environmental system, because we've taken, and other companies are now following, this consumer electronic product approach to satellites. So the conversation we need to have is, how do we break that approach and adopt something that's more sustainable? Does that require limits on satellites? Does it require extending the lifespan of satellites as part of a regulatory process? We don't have the answers yet, but if we continue to treat Earth orbit as if it is infinite, the next generation is going to look back at us and say, you guys were crazy. You should have known, because you did this with the oceans. You have a plastic crisis in the ocean that you didn't see 20 years before. And now this generation, the decision makers today, they know about plastic in the ocean. They're being more careful about that, but they're being completely careless when it comes to putting more and more mass in orbit.
On that note, let's talk about debris and other tests. You have been on the forefront of campaigning against that. You led international calls against debris creating other tests. Where are we now in terms of this global momentum, and what verification tools could make this memorandum credible?
We began advocating against kinetic anti-satellite weapon tests before Russia tested a ground-based missile against a defunct Soviet-era satellite in November 2021. India had tested 2 years earlier, had tried to avoid creating debris by having a test at a relatively low orbit, had failed to prevent the creation of debris. There was debris. And then Russia behaved very irresponsibly in November 2021. The good thing is that those two tests helped draw international attention to the problem, which is that a high energy impact in low Earth orbit between two sizable objects is going to create many thousands of pieces of debris, many of which will be on elliptical orbits that will cross the orbits of 1,000 or more satellites, including the International Space Station. So it's dangerous. And it's not just a question of the debris that we can identify and track. There will be tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of additional pieces that are too small to identify and track, but have enough energy to penetrate a spacesuit or to destroy the electronics of a satellite. So it's a really stupid thing to do, to test a kinetic anti-satellite weapon. A very antisocial thing to do. And to some degree, I think our advocacy combined with the Indian and the Russian tests, the Joe Biden administration started to move on this, with the Vice President Kamala Harris announcing that the United States was going to renounce any option of future American testing. So they made what in international law is called a unilateral declaration. They bound themselves legally to never test a ground-based missile against a satellite again. And more than 30 other countries, allies of the United States, followed, including all the member states of the European Union. Now, that didn't include Russia, didn't include China. And some people will say that doesn't solve the long-term problem. It certainly doesn't include Pakistan or Iran or North Korea that might at some point in time wish to do their own test once they have the ability to do that. But I actually think that it starts to change the conversation, and with the conversation, it creates a normative expectation that we know now, even though Russia and China have not made these declarations, that it's a socially unacceptable thing to do. That it is, if you were to do this, you would attract international concern and your reputation as a responsible space actor would suffer. You start to change the expectations.
How concerned are you seeing the recent military strategic developments in space. This is placements of weapons, not weapons of mass destruction at the moment, but we see that many of the militaries refocusing on space of an active military domain. It always was, but it was then lowered, and now it's coming back, inclusive offensive capabilities, as they call it.
The first thing to say is that no country has ever tested or used a kinetic weapon against another country's satellite. It's never happened. So yes, there might be a buildup in capability, a change in rhetoric, but we haven't crossed the Rubicon yet. No one has actually done it. And this is despite the fact that satellites have been very important in the context of the Ukraine war and could arguably be legitimate targets. And neither Russia nor NATO countries have taken that step. I am very concerned that some countries have adopted a forward-leaning stance. I think the U.S. Space Force talking about space as a warfighting domain is dangerous and counterproductive. It's a little bit like deciding to call your Department of Defense the Department of War. It sends a signal, and it's not a signal that helps keep the peace. So I disagree with that. And I don't like the fact that some other countries are now stopped talking about space as an operational domain. That includes my country, Canada. It just does not contribute in a positive way to use that kind of language. Yes, we have a lot of satellites that provide communications and imagery for militaries on the ground. And that has been the case since the 1960s. But we have to avoid the words that we use because they can be escalatory. In terms of weapons in space, the widespread knowledge that debris-creating events are counterproductive for everyone has created a situation of almost mutually assured destruction for the major spacefaring states. I'm not worried about China deciding that it makes sense to have kinetic impacts in low Earth orbit because China is now very dependent on low Earth orbit. I think there's a deterrence factor there. I also think that the emphasis in terms of technology development has shifted to non-kinetic means. So cyber warfare, absolutely. Possibly rendezvous and proximity operations, very actively jamming and spoofing of satellite signals. I don't think we should be cavalier about jamming and spoofing. There's a lot of it occurring all along the frontier with Russia in Eastern Europe, all the way up to the Barents Sea, north of Finland and Norway. It's dangerous to civilian aviation. And so I condemn any country that engages in jamming or spoofing. This is dangerous, irresponsible behavior, and we should start to call it out for what it is. But again, no country has used a kinetic weapon against another country's spacecraft during the entire history of human behavior in space. That's a positive. And we should try to hold that line because if we go beyond that, we risk losing safe access to Earth orbit for everyone. And the most significant impacts will not be felt by militaries. It will be felt by the billions of civilians who depend upon satellites for agriculture, right? For communications, for science. This is the point, right? Is that the most significant impacts will be to literally billions of human beings because some general or some president was too short-sighted to realize the long-term impacts, the negative impacts, greatly outweigh any benefit from having any kind of armed conflict in space.
Let's talk about the next big thing on my list, mega constellations and the night sky. You alluded to that earlier in our conversation. So mega constellations offer global connectivity, but also raise congestions and astronomical concerns. So what would be a fair governance framework look like?
The first thing to say is we need a governance framework with regards to mega constellations because China is starting to construct 2 mega constellations of its own. And so low Earth orbit is going to become much more crowded. SpaceX has had a near monopoly, and the majority of operational satellites today are SpaceX satellites. And we've already seen problems. It's not just the light pollution, the radio pollution. These are communication satellites. And as the Chinese proceed and other operators, Amazon going up as well, that is from the United States. But we're going to see an increasingly congested, polluted low Earth orbit and pollution from orbit down to Earth. So we come back to issues of promoting best practice. And you can do that in various ways. You can do that simply by pointing out that it makes more sense for a company to adopt a certain approach as opposed to an older approach. I think the SpaceX approach is old-fashioned now. I think the idea of having 10,000 or more disposable satellites doesn't stack up economically against the new model of having just a few hundred higher capacity, more resilient, longer-lived satellites. So I think the Eutelsat OneWeb or the Telesat Lightspeed model may actually be a more modern and effective model. So just actually getting companies and shareholders and investors to realize that the SpaceX approach is yesterday's approach. It was innovative. It changed the world. But it's 10 years old now in terms of its conception and in terms of what we knew then as compared to what we know now. There's been a decade of learning. So it's not just about imposing rules. It's making people realize that smart cutting-edge companies are taking a different approach today.
Will there be enough spectrum? What we see, in my opinion, is an orbital grab plus a spectrum grab.
Yes, both things are happening. And I look to the International Telecommunication Union, which is one of the most effective international organizations in any domain to continue to deal with this issue. They adopted a milestones approach, which was a good faith effort to solve a problem. And it has eliminated some actors who were not ready from getting into the orbital domain. It has worked to the advantage of SpaceX, ironically. But I also think that it's a question of getting national governments to realize that it might not be in your national interest to license a satellite system that's going to follow the SpaceX approach and contribute to these massive problems. Now, what's happening in the United States under the Trump administration is a separate issue. But I want to see environmental impact assessments done before the licensing of any new mega constellations, like proper, serious environmental impact assessments that take into account the potential climate change effects or ozone depletion effects associated with this.
But how do you value that against national sovereignty? Because that's at the moment the striking arguments for constellations run by countries, militaries or by commercial operators within countries to have our sovereign access, our sovereign capabilities as a nation state.
Sure. So do what Canada did and have Telesat Lightspeed with just a couple of hundred resilient, long-lived satellites, cutting-edge satellites that will provide the service that Canada needs so that we're not dependent on Elon Musk and his radical changes in position with regards to, for instance, providing coverage to the Ukrainian military in the Black Sea. But it's also in the national interest not to lose safe access to low Earth orbit, to not risk losing the ozone layer. The Montreal Protocol on chlorofluorocarbons is, according to the United Nations Environmental Program, saving 2 million lives per year by preventing skin cancers. So there's a bigger picture here. Like, what is in the national interest? Is it just to have your own satellites so you have some sovereign capacity? Okay, but be responsible about how you go about doing this. The other thing to realize in this domain is that there's still a lot of room for burden sharing, right? Not every country needs to have its own satellite system. It needs reliable allies. It can pool its resources. And as more and more systems go up, you then have more options for this kind of burden sharing.
I'm curious to learn your definition of a reliable ally.
And you obviously more than just one reliable ally, because we've seen what's happened in the United States. But I would also argue that between Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump, the level of cooperation and cohesion among the other NATO allies is stronger than ever before, right? And Canada is an associate member of the European Space Agency. It's a member of NATO. And I can tell everyone that Canada feels much more European today, thanks to Donald Trump.
We highly invite you to come to Europe. So if you could move a continent, that would be easy. But you spoke about the environmental impact, and I would stick on that and the environmental assessment. So how could that the environmental impact of space activities is not just in space, as we mentioned before, it's also when it comes down with the re-entry effects on Earth's atmosphere. What do we know and what actions should already be on the table today?
The first thing that we know is that we actually need more scientific research. Aaron Boley and I published an article on mega constellations in 2021, where we identified that mass does not disappear. And so thousands of re-entering satellites would be putting billions of particles into the upper atmosphere. And this could have climate or ozone depletion effects. But that was speculation, right? We knew that particles were going to go into the atmosphere because they wouldn't go anywhere else. But we didn't know anything about what the actual effects would be. And we spoke to a few satellite companies about this, and they dismissed us that this was purely speculative. And there was a German group that published a paper concurrently that was making the same hypothesis. And someone at NOAA, the National Oceans and Atmospheric Administration in the United States, must have read one of these two articles, or maybe both, because NOAA and NASA took up their high-altitude science plane, a WB-57 from the Korean War. They took it up to Alaska in March of 2023, flew it up to 60,000 feet because in March, stratospheric air is forced down over Alaska. And they sampled stratospheric air and ran it through a mass spectrometer and found significantly elevated levels of aluminum in aerosols in the stratosphere and some obscure alloys like niobium that are used in the nozzles of rocket engines. So pretty clear evidence that there is a fingerprint of space activities in the stratosphere. And this is not from stuff going up, it's from stuff coming down. And so all of a sudden, things got much more serious. So our speculation was now proven. And the question is, what actual chemical reactions would take place and what consequences would those reactions have? And that's what we don't know yet. And that's why there needs to be a global push for cutting-edge science to figure out, is this a worst-case scenario or is it a best-case scenario? Is all this aluminum reflecting solar energy back into space and helping to slow climate change possible? Or is it absorbing heat through the infrared spectrum and contributing to climate change? We don't know. Is all this aluminum going to create locations for reactions that destroy ozone? Worst case scenario? Yeah. Or is it not doing that? Best case scenario. So it's the science that we need. And then while we're doing that science, and this is expensive science, right? I'm making a pitch for some major research funds here. Aaron Boley and the Outer Space Institute and I could lead that project if someone wants to give us money. But then you also need to think about, okay, if we end up finding out that this is a worst case situation, what do we do next? And that's when I start talking about things like breaking the consumer electronic product approach to satellites. How can we incentivize the space industry to not treat orbit as infinite, but to treat it as something that needs to be collectively managed? And we do this in other domains. So we have extreme tension between Russia and NATO countries today. But the most successful co-managed fishery in the whole world is in the Barents Sea between Russia and Norway. And those two countries continue to set scientifically based quotas each year for Atlantic cod in that ocean, right? And I can give you lots of other examples. If you can show real science that identifies a collective threat, then you can co-manage. And you need to manage with a view to having that resource available in 10 years and in 50 years. Otherwise, you're into a tragedy of the commons and you lose everything. So that's the conversation I want to start. So we need more science. So any cuts to scientific research concerning space are short-sighted and destructive. But we also need to be starting those conversations about how do we manage space as a shared resource in ways that work to all of our advantages.
On that note, we have to finish our conversation. I would like to talk about inclusivity, including the global south. I mean, space governance often reflects the big power dynamics of the handful of spacefaring nations today. How do we ensure voices from the global south help shape the rules from the stars? Or do we say we don't need them? They have to accept what we put up on the table in an old-fashioned colonial way.
One of the major spacefaring countries that people don't talk about is Chile, which is host to some of the world's most important and expensive astronomical telescopes. It depends what you think about it as space, right? If you start thinking about astronomy, then Chile, South Africa is going to be host to a very significant radio observatory, for instance. If you start talking about the role of satellite imagery in agriculture, then India is at the top of the list. So it depends on what you look at, right? If you're just looking at the space industry narrowly defined, yes, it's a U.S.-dominated system. If you're looking at it from a security perspective, it's Russia, it's the United States, it's China. But the fact of the matter is that space is global and lots of different actors have stakes in this, and many of them have investments and host infrastructure. A broader perspective solves some of the problem. The other issue, though, is that we need to maintain venues where we can hear other voices. And I put a lot of importance on the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space because it provides such a venue. Not all United Nations member states are members of that committee, although more and more are applying and joining each year. but it is a place where people are not just talking in the committee room over the microphones, but are mingling in the corridor and in the cafe. And there are those contacts, the mutual learning that takes place is absolutely invaluable.
We see more and more side events going on there, informative, left and center. So it's interesting to see this week of Copius, how that developed over the last years.
And then the other thing too is, especially post-pandemic, the whole world has been more accustomed to gathering online. And you've made a huge contribution to this online education opportunity that is enabling people from the global south, or young people especially, to be part of these conversations. It's a democratizing force. It depends on good information. It depends on reliable journalists doing high-quality work. There's a lot of noise out there. There's a lot of misinformation. Misinformation creates security dilemmas. Good information is invaluable. But I'm optimistic. I think there's a growing recognition that we can't have these problems solved by just a few actors because they have different interests from the rest of humanity. But we do have an opportunity for, I wouldn't call it global democracy because not all of the countries involved are democracies, but we do have a continued opportunity for widespread multilateralism on these issues. Sometimes people say that the glass is half full or it's half empty, and these are dangerous and difficult times in international affairs, but the glass is always 1/4 full, at least. There's still some reason always for optimism.
Great. Michael, thank you very much for your time and this very interesting and thought-provoking Space Café radio. Thank you very much.
And let me just say that for once, in real, it's coming from a cafe.
Absolutely. Thank you.
If you have further questions, reach out to us at radio@SpaceWatch.Global. If you like these or other episodes of Space Café Radio, leave us a rating on your preferred podcast platform. It is the currency of today. And if you want to stay on the pulse of the space industry, please visit our website at www.SpaceWatch.Global and subscribe to our newsletters. And of course, don't forget to become a Space Watcher. I'm Thorsten Triening, publisher at SpaceWatch.Global, your independent perspective on space.